Being here. I'm Ed Pruitt, Editorial Director of NEJM Catalyst, and I'm delighted to be on an interview here with Eveline Bischoff, with whom I've previously spoken several months ago, but now here the situation has changed dramatically. Eveline is Associate Professor at the Shanghai University School of Medicine and Health Sciences, and researcher at University Hospital in Basel, Switzerland. And Jeremy Levin is Chairman and CEO of Ovid Therapeutics and also Chairman of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. So we're here to talk about biotechnology advancements in healthcare for clinicians, COVID-19 and beyond. So, so much to talk about, but why don't we begin with a book that the two of you recently collaborated on and Jeremy edited. Biotechnology in the Time of COVID-19, Commentaries from the Front Line. Would you please briefly describe that effort?
Yes, well, perhaps I'll start with the concept and then talk to you a little bit about what we hope to accomplish. And then Eveline, who actually is one of the authors in it, can talk to you about her chapter because it's quite representative of what we try to accomplish. In January this year, I was in Cambodia. And what struck me in Cambodia was it was deserted. There were no Chinese tourists. Normally it has a large number of Chinese tourists. And people in the street clearly had fear in their eye. There is no doubt about it. They were worried about people passing them. And on my return to the United States, it was apparent that the CDC, the political echelon, had taken no notice or were ignoring what was clearly coming. And it was evident in all sorts of ways, disorganization, political statements, all sorts of things, which I felt were really rather troubling because it represented a degree of unpreparedness which would prove catastrophic and has now proved catastrophic to the United States. Indeed, so I assembled at the time, as rapidly as I could in early February, the entire biotech community who might have some interest, and I use it, might have some interest in COVID. Now, there were amongst those, there were only 40 companies at the time. And amongst those were Moderna, and of course, Pfizer was on the board of Bio. And we all got together and basically put our heads together, and it became apparent that individually, there were remarkable stories. Stefan Bancel, for example, was in Paris when he heard about this and flew back to the United States with the intent to say, could he pivot his company Moderna and get into trying to find cures for this. So while I brought them all together in one table, it became rapidly apparent that they needed all to be organized, exchange ideas, and effectively recognize that nobody was going to help us from the government at that time. Nobody. And they did. Remarkable. The entire industry pivoted. So I felt that this pivot was essential to record because it demonstrates what a strategic industry can do when it puts its mind to it. Recall, Ed, 50% of all investment in the end of 2019 in research and development was in oncology. There was no projects, zero, in COVID-19. You fast forward to today, and we're 10 months in, well, a little bit more. We now have 800 projects, of which you were within days of having approval for the first vaccine, and indeed distribution already in the United Kingdom. So the industry pivoted, and finally recognizing that that this was a salutary moment in industry, I asked 47 of the leaders at that time to write about their experiences so that we would record forever what was occurring right then, and we would not forget it, the motivations, the interests, etc. And in the case of some of the statements that were being made, for example, in March, the fallacious statement that hydroxychloroquine was of any value were examples of where politics was entering into what should be absolutely science and medicine. And I wanted it clearly laid out in this book that what mattered was commitment to patients, science and medicine, and a rigor. And that's what happened. The book was published in June, the first week of June. And I know that over 1 million copies, I believe, were downloaded around the world. But each one of those is a story of an individual. Each one is the story of what they focused on. And I asked Evelyn and her colleagues to write because they have a particularly unique perspective on the role of artificial intelligence and on the rigor of publishing and looking at peer review of documentation. So for me, this was a moment where I had an advantage and could ask various people. Stefan Bancel is in there in that book. So is, that's from Moderna. Pfizer's in the book. You have Merck in the book. You have literally other companies that are really developing interesting programs and still are, some of which will be approved hopefully very shortly. So it's a collection of 47. It's a time in history and it's recorded now. So perhaps I'll let Evelyn talk about her experience, because I know when I asked them, I thought they probably thought I was a bit nuts because they were all scrambling as well. But every single one of these authors took time out and in lightning speed. You're a publisher, you know what this means. We took that book from zero to publication by literally in a couple of months.
Incredibly timely. Evelyn.
Indeed, yes. Thank you so much. This book was really a particular experience in so many ways. So definitely it outlined also something that for me is a major positive outcome of COVID. And as you remember in my last podcast, I also wanted also to end always with a positive note. So the positive note is that the various players in healthcare are finally communicating. And so it wouldn't be without COVID and collaborations that I would be invited for this book and met Jeremy and be invited to write a chapter actually with Alex Javoronkov, a professor who is running in silico medicine and AI biotech company that is focusing on drug development, in silico drug development and drug repurposing. So what it means is they develop molecules, compounds based on what machine is actually giving as an output on data, which is a tremendous, one of the most important future features, I believe, for the clinics. But going back to the book, I believe it was just a great opportunity and an honor for me as a clinician. I don't know if there were other clinicians among the authors, but for me it was really a pleasure to give a perspective of a doctor, of a physician, emerged also in this new world of biotech that with the onset of pandemic, with a light speed basically transformed the healthcare and how we approach such emergent events. So starting from drug development over the vaccines, but also other algorithms that were helpful and very important for tracing and so on. And interestingly, or importantly, Jeremy has asked, I believe, all of us to not only give our experience, but to end up each chapter with an outlook and to end it with a sentence starting, imagine a world being like. So basically this book also contains 47 biotech KPIs from the key opinion leaders. So I believe this is also really a golden well for ideas. And yes, it was an amazing opportunity to collaborate and to bring this idea forward. Maybe on a last note, it also brought us further and gave us the idea to spread this message more among clinicians and scientists. And so it's developed into a paper, actually again initiated by Jeremy and Alex Javoronkov, published in Nature Biotech recently, where we discussed AI in drug development, drug repurposing, and in rigorous peer review. And it was also, let's say, catalyzed by the developments at that time in terms of hydroxychloroquine debate and the drastic and dramatic side effects that we have seen in this context.
Mm-hmm. Well, so much has happened rapidly, and this book, in a way, captures the developments. Jeremy, please describe the development of the COVID vaccines from your perspective. Are you surprised at how quickly this has happened? Because things look very different when you were putting together that book, and things look very different when Evelyn and I spoke previously.
Well, for all my colleagues in the front line of seeing patients, I think it's important to distinguish what the book was trying to accomplish and what they're doing, because they're very different. And then I'll go quickly to your comment, Ed. It's an important one because it deals with drug discovery. I think it's important to recognize that when this book was being conceived of, the clinicians in the emergency rooms, for example, of Mount Sinai, were running out of all the equipment they needed, or thought they needed. They didn't, for example, they thought they needed vast numbers of respiratory support systems. In actual fact, the kinds that they were looking for are now not known to be that helpful. At the same time, they didn't have the understanding that dexamethasone was a critical component of therapeutics. They didn't know that in actual fact that transmissibility was as severe as it was. And the spectrum of medical catastrophe that you saw coming from this virus was remarkable. There are all sorts of theories, cytokine storm, all sorts of things that were being mooted, but it was a strange and unusual disorder with terrible consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So while the front line was bending, and I do mean bending, there were instances where I would get calls, desperate calls from hospitals looking for reagents to make a diagnostic so they could decide who had this disorder in those early days. Biotech had a different and in many ways an easier route, because the day-to-day wasn't necessarily dealing with that catastrophe that was overwhelming at that stage, the East Coast and the West Coast, or for that matter in Italy, where you just saw these really disastrous situations. Biotech did a couple things. Number one, they acknowledged that this could be a disastrous entity. Number one. Number two, what they did, and the biotech, I use the word here in a very broad sense because it means both large companies and small companies. They did a couple things. First of all, they exited the labs in many cases. It became virtual very quickly, very quickly. They understood who were essential workers who had to go into the lab. And where there were shortages, for example, of rubber gloves, and there were, many of the biotech companies said, look, the immediate response is let's collect all of these things that we have and hand them to our local hospitals, which is what they did. At the same time, the vaccine thinking really evolved very quickly. And as you know, there are 6 different approaches that were adopted. Those 6 different approaches were not independent, or were independent of those who decided they were going to go after antivirals, and independent of those who are going to look at repurposed medicines and ask the question, would they have an effect? And independent also of those who are asking, do I have an existing drug that I could try, like remdesivir? And so a lot of activity really grew out of that moment in the beginning of February 2020. But in the vaccine side, it was truly remarkable. For the first time, you saw large companies, GSK and Sanofi, actually contributing. One talking about an adjuvant, the other one talking about an antigen. How could they put them together? This is very difficult. This is like the dance of the porcupines. But the porcupines found a way to work together. And this was consistent across all of the industry. Every single head of research agreed that there would be a sharing of information right up front. Anything that would not lead necessarily to a product, but that would be helpful for the development of a product was shared. New little companies who were talking to the big companies were shared. In the case, for example, of AstraZeneca in the United Kingdom and the NIH, they set up a specific program to assess with the NIH, the National Health Service, specific small companies who were offering ideas, a process for evaluating them. So you had government-industry collaboration of a remarkable fashion. You had industry-industry interaction of a remarkable fashion. And all of this, in the meantime, against the backdrop of spiral chaos in the clinical world. So I want to draw a distinction between what was going on clinically and what was going on industrially about the medicines. And it's important to understand that distinction. The reason why is that when you develop a drug, the most important thing that you do is to understand not just the mechanism of action, but also the populations that it affects. Because you cannot run a clinical trial without understanding who it is that you need to test. So I think when you consider that moment, it's running, chewing gum, giving a speech, and at the same time knowing that your competitors are dying around you, the patients that you want to treat. This was a catastrophic moment with no understanding of what the necessary or the need to understand what the clinical progress was, the natural history of this disorder, so that you could construct trials. So it wasn't just the 6 different technologies. It was also assembling an understanding of what the patients looked like, what the progression of this disorder was looking like. And I'll stop for a second because I've covered a lot of ground here. But for clinicians listening in, you should understand from drug development, you had a series of completely unknown items that needed to be dealt with. And then to add complexity to that, you needed, if you were going to develop this drug, or any one of these drugs, or any one of the vaccines, you needed to understand capacity for manufacturing. And I know, Evelyn, you're a very positive person, but it was nothing short of extraordinary for me, and I do need to say this, that at the very time when those complexities were playing out, while you had the FDA rising to the occasion, BARDA trying to do its best, the political echelon in this country tried to crush that by removing effective CDC tracing, removing effective BARDA funding of manufacturing, and trying to accelerate anything that might work without process in the FDA. Mm-hmm. Despite this, and I say despite it, we need to say that, the industry collaborated with the FDA. The FDA collaborated with the CDC, with the NIH, and with BARDA. And finally, the manufacturing side was solved by bringing in a clinician, Monsef Salui, who was the head of GSK's vaccine production and research and development, and a highly ethical physician who basically said, I'm not interested in politics, I'm going to solve the manufacturing. So it wasn't just the 6 technologies, it wasn't just the development that was critical, and we can talk more about this, and how they absorbed information from the patient bases, or this panoply of other trials ongoing, but in addition to that, it was manufacturing. So one of the most complex, extraordinary efforts that we've ever seen in the industry, but intimately related to physicians, and the output now is coming close to when clinicians need to understand all of that in order for them to be able to administer to patients what they need. So I'll stop for a second, Ed, and I'm sure this has been a long soliloquy, and my apologies.